You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 159. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Have you ever had the experience of trying to set a boundary only to be met with pushback? If so, you are not alone and you are absolutely in the right place. That is exactly what we're going to dive into in today's podcast episode. Before we dive into that, I would love to invite you to an upcoming webinar that I am offering. It is a free webinar. It's on Friday, June 14th at noon Pacific time. And we are going to be diving into leadership for women lawyers. Whether you are at the beginning stages of your practice and you're looking ahead into what leadership is going to look like for you, or if you're at a stage in your practice where you are stepping into leadership, maybe you're a mid to senior level associate and you're taking on an increasing leadership role within your organization. You may be transitioning to partner, or you've transitioned to partner and you're really embracing and embodying the leader that you are. Or maybe you've stepped into your own practice and you're looking to develop your skills as a leader of yourself, a leader of your organization. This training will offer you some ideas and some strategies that you can put into effect to really step into leadership. At that training, I will also be talking about an upcoming program that I'm offering that you may be interested in joining. In July, I will be beginning a 6-month program. It is a group coaching and mastermind program for women lawyers. I will be forming a group of up to 8 women lawyers where we are going to focus on your growth and development. It is very much aligned with a version of this program that I have been offering over the past year and a half. The difference this time around is that there will be more of a focus on leadership. It is a theme that I have noticed emerge among the other 3 groups of women that I have led through this process. And so what I would love to do here is to maintain the same themes, but do it through a leadership lens. So we will be covering in each of the months, starting with July, first setting a goal. So this would be a goal that aligns with your leadership goals. Then we move into self-concept. So that is designing who you want to be as a leader within your practice. We then move on to obstacles. So anytime that you set a big goal for yourself, you will notice that the obstacles and roadblocks will automatically reveal themselves, and that becomes your work. That becomes your blueprint for how to reach your goals. From there, we move into confidence, authority, and power. What does that look like for you when you assume leadership? Then we talk about boundaries and what that involves, what your boundaries are designed to protect, how you're going to set and enforce those boundaries. And then finally, we conclude with sustainable growth and success. In addition to those 6 months, so there's a theme per month, we also have individual trainings on transitions and time management. Those are topics that I find are very common in the coaching work that I do with lawyers. And so we will have 2 sessions in addition to the regular curriculum over the 6 months to dive into those topics. And I will tailor those topics to the group. So if that's something that interests you, you absolutely will want to sign up for the webinar. If you can't make the webinar live, no problem. I will send you a recording. There will be a link in the show notes to sign up for the webinar. And if you can't find it for whatever reason, feel free to send me an email, a message on LinkedIn, and I will send you the registration information. So again, please join me Friday, June 14th, noon Pacific time. I would love to have you there. Now, moving back to our podcast episode for today, the topic for discussion is this idea of what you do when you go to set a boundary, and instead of that boundary being met with a, sure, that's a great idea, you're met with resistance, you're met with pushback, you're met with a no. Now, this comes up in a couple of ways in your practice, and I'm going to explain each of those. The first way that I see it come up is when you go to assert a boundary. So the boundary that you might be setting is maybe a reduction in terms of the volume of work you're taking on. You find that you're already maxed out, your days are full, you don't have capacity to take on more work, and yet you seem to be assigned more work and you try to say no. And the response is, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to find a way to do this. It may be that you're trying to narrow your practice area. So maybe you're doing a particular type of work. You don't want to do more of that work. You want to move into something a little bit different. And you've had conversations about that. And yet the work that you are not wanting to do continues to flow your way. You're having difficulty making those adjustments. So those are ways in which you are trying to set a boundary. And instead of that boundary being met with a yes, it is met with pushback. Another area where you might find pushback is when you are the person who is trying to seek help. You may be asking other lawyers to help you out. You may be asking support staff to help you out. And instead of getting the help that you need, you are met with pushback. You are met with a no, I cannot do it, I will not do it, or the person may take on the work, but they don't do it in a way that is helpful. They may not do it according to the standard that is required. They may not do it on the timelines that are required. And so what this can lead to, especially if this is happening at the same time, is that you are in this perfect storm where you have too much on your plate and not enough support. And so the purpose of today's episode is to help you figure out what to do in this type of situation. Now, before I dive in, I would just love to mention that I have talked about boundaries on the podcast before. I have recorded a podcast episode about how to say no without burning bridges. That's episode number 62. In episode number 37, I talked about how to create boundaries with ease. I've talked about the relationship between boundaries and time management. So how setting boundaries can help you reclaim your time. That's episode 131. And then most recently, Bina Stock came onto the podcast, been on a couple of times. She is a counselor for lawyers. She has lots of great things to share. And so she and I had a wonderful discussion about boundaries for lawyers. That was episode 139. So if you're looking for other resources about boundaries, you'll find those in previous episodes of the podcast. The difference today is that we're focusing not only on boundaries and boundaries setting, but we're also talking about what to do when you get that pushback, how to deal with that resistance. Now, if we take a step back and look at this problem, first of all, I'd just like to say that if you're experiencing this, you're not alone. This is a conversation that comes up fairly often in coaching conversations that I have with my clients. I know when I was in practice, I dealt with this issue, and now I'm helping other lawyers as they are dealing with this issue. And it's not a surprise that this happens. Number one, I think just generally across the board, humans don't particularly like dealing with boundaries. I don't know anybody who relishes the act of setting boundaries. If you have set boundaries in the past, maybe it's a process that you really love. If you do love that process, I applaud you. It hasn't really been my experience. I think most of the people who struggle with boundaries don't really want to do it in the first place. They don't like saying no. They don't like feeling like they're disappointing somebody. The list goes on. And people generally don't love receiving boundaries either. Now, there is some element of clarity that is really wonderful when somebody sets a boundary with you. Once you know what the rules are, there's a certain safety in that. But there's also this companion reality that when somebody sets a boundary with you, it may mean that you don't get to do things that you previously enjoyed. And so you see it with kids sometimes where you set a boundary with them, and when they're really little, I mean, they'll truly show you how they feel. You'll see the tantrum, you'll see the, but mom, if you have kids, chances are you can relate to that. So on either side of the equation, nobody really likes to say no to others, and nobody really likes to be said no to. So that's just starting out as humans interacting in this world. We add to that next layer of the legal profession, right? We are talking about saying no in the context of your professional work. We can also apply this outside of your professional work, but if we're looking at it through the lens of you in your capacity as a lawyer, we need to look at the culture in which you're operating. And the legal profession is often a culture of yes. There is a tendency in law for the profession to attract individuals who are helpers. They are entering the profession because they want to help other people. The profession also tends to attract high achievers, people who are predisposed to wanting to do more. And so when you go to set a boundary, when you go to say no, you may feel like you're going against the grain of what is culturally around you, and you may be going against the grain of your own internal wiring. Now, we can also add to this that many lawyers, people who enter the legal profession, tend to be risk averse. And when it comes to setting boundaries, there is some element of risk there, right? If you're setting boundaries and there's an unknown on the other side of that conversation, that introduces a level of discomfort that may be difficult for you to face. So what can happen then is you struggle with boundaries because you're going against the cultural norm. And we've talked about that in the legal profession. There may also be further cultural programming that makes you feel reluctant to set boundaries. So for example, you might struggle with boundaries because of what you make boundaries mean. This may have been learned from your family, from your environment. But what it might mean is that you think that setting boundaries means that you are selfish, that you are rude, that you don't care about other people, that you're not a team player. And so this can lead to a perfect storm, right? Where you struggle to set boundaries with others, and you may also struggle to ask for what you want. So, it's hard enough to ask for what you want in the first place or to set those boundaries. But then we get into the situation that we're talking about today, right? Where not only have you asked for this thing that you were uncomfortable to ask for in the first place, but then you get pushback, right? So it's asking for work not to be added onto your plate, and you're told, you know what, you're going to have to do it anyways, or you try to delegate a task and the person that you try to delegate it to says no. And so you're kind of stuck in this position, right? Where you've got more on your plate than you can handle. You don't have the support that you need. And maybe because of the way that you feel about boundaries, the way that you feel in terms of your sense of hard work, in terms of your willingness to get things done, your willingness to sacrifice, right? To do things at your own expense in order to serve the greater good, you might be telling yourself, well, I can do it, therefore I should do it. I am capable. I have the time, even if that means cutting into other areas of your life where you really do need and want to allocate time. You might tell yourself it's unfair to impose on others and make them do it. You might rationalize it by saying, well, the client really needs it. It's just this once. It's only going to take me a minute. And you might find that you're feeling so perplexed, right? When somebody says no, or when they resist your boundary, that you're so perplexed in the moment that you don't really know how to respond. You might find that you try to avoid confrontation. You take on the work, and even though you've tried to assert that boundary or you've asked for help and you're not met with the response that you want, you end up doing it anyways, and then you start to feel resentful. You might find that you complain to others who are close to you, and yet you don't really get any traction. You might hope that things get better on their own. And what you might be doing, and this really does break my heart, is that you then might point the finger at yourself. You might blame yourself and beat yourself up for not having asserted your boundary, for not having pressed ahead and insisted on what you need. And so not only are you saddled with the extra work or whatever it is that you were trying to draw the boundary around, but now you've also ruptured that relationship with yourself. So what I am focusing on here today are some solutions, some ideas to help you in that situation. You've tried to assert the boundary, you've mustered the courage, you've tried to have the conversation, and it hasn't worked. And so what do you do next? And we're going to look at this through 4 different shifts. And as we go through these shifts, what I would invite you to think about is where you are right now in terms of your comfort levels and confidence in setting boundaries and dealing with pushback, and where you want to be at some point in the future. So in that point in the future, you feel confident setting your boundaries. You feel confident when other people push back. You feel confident moving forward. And so I want you to imagine you're at point A currently. You want to get to point B. And so what is the difference between what you're doing, what you're thinking, how you're feeling at point A, and what you're doing, how you're feeling, how you're thinking in point B? So looking at the first lens, the first shift that I'm going to invite you to make is to look at the framework of awareness. So Right now, if you feel like your boundaries aren't where you want them to be, that you're having a hard time dealing with pushback, I would invite you to first think about where it is that you have trouble with your boundaries. So if we look at you at work, for example, in a professional context, chances are there are certain areas where you struggle more than others. So let's gain awareness about where those areas are. Where do you have trouble asserting your boundaries? Where are you experiencing pushback? Now, it may be that there are certain individuals in your professional life where you find it particularly difficult to set boundaries, to assert boundaries. These are people who are pushing back. It might be other lawyers that you're working with. It might be clients that you're working with. Who are they? And I would love for you to make an inventory in terms of who they are. Now, this work applies in your professional context, but let's face it, you also have a life outside of work where you have friends, you have family, you have people in your life who want things from you. And so I would invite you, while we're on the topic of boundaries, to think about other areas in your life where you struggle to assert your boundaries. So maybe you have somebody who's there to help you with the kids, and when it comes time to asking for what you need, you feel uncomfortable asking, or you ask and they don't really do the things that you have asked them to do. So that might be an example of something that's happening outside of the office where you want to draw a firmer boundary. It might be social invitations, it might be tasks or projects that relate to your children or other family members. So what I'd like you to do here is just to gain that awareness of where you struggle with boundaries across the board in your personal and in your professional life. And what this is doing is this is going to help you to turn boundaries into something that you prioritize. So if boundaries have just been this thing that you're vaguely aware of that you may or may not try to enforce when it's convenient or when you really feel like it's necessary, we're going to shift this around so that your awareness is heightened. This is the first step, taking this inventory. And what this is going to do is give you some points of purchase where you can start to practice. Now, as you do this, you may find that you start to get a little bit annoyed. You might start to get annoyed with other people. You might start to get annoyed with yourself. You might start to see the injustices that are happening in your life because of this lack of boundaries. And if that is happening for you, I would love to share two messages. Number one, please, please, please be gracious with yourself. I find sometimes when I am doing this type of work, whether I'm looking at boundaries, whether I'm looking at areas of my life where I'm tolerating certain behaviors or certain situations, I can start to feel a little bit agitated because I realize that this is really bothering me. It may be something that I don't try to focus my attention on. And when I do, I start to have some negative feelings. I start to feel frustrated. And so if this is happening for you in this moment, first of all, I would love for you to give yourself the grace of going through this exercise in a way that is not judgmental, that is solutions focused, and where you are giving yourself the utmost compassion. Now, I would also encourage you, the second message is to give others the benefit of the doubt. You might find that as you start to identify people in your life where you have trouble asserting boundaries, that you might start to have ill feelings, you might start to feel frustrated with them, you might start to feel a bit of judgment. That is perfectly okay. You're human. It's normal. And what I would invite you to do is to try to suspend the judgment and shift into more of a framework of curiosity and giving them the benefit of the doubt rather than making assumptions. And we will talk about this a little bit more in a later stage of the process, but what I would love for you to take away from this first step is awareness. So again, going back to that model where you're looking at point A, point B, the first thing that you want to consider is that version of you in the future who feels confident about setting boundaries, has much greater awareness about where she needs to place those boundaries, and she also has given priority to dealing with these boundaries. So that is step one. Step two is where we get into some of the really deep work when it comes to boundaries. It's deep work because it requires you to take that level of awareness, first of all. So we've established where you struggle with boundaries, and now we're going to go to an even deeper level. What I would love for you to think about first is your beliefs about boundaries. So I mentioned a few minutes ago this idea of culture, right? These ideas that are culturally ingrained, whether it's within the legal profession, whether it's in your family of origin, or simply the expectations that you've adopted from society. So what is it that you believe about boundaries? I gave a few examples before, things like believing that boundaries are a sign that you are selfish, that you do not care, that you are not a team player. There may be others, that you are unhelpful. So think about how it is that you are thinking about boundaries in your mind's eye. This is really important because chances are you haven't given a ton of thought into how at an unconscious level you're thinking about boundaries. And yet that unconscious thinking is driving so much of your behavior when it comes to setting boundaries. So that is the first step, is what are you currently thinking? The other part of this, and again, this is really deep work, is to think about yourself. How the thoughts that you have, the beliefs that you have about yourself are impacting your relationship with boundaries. So this is where it can be a little bit triggering. And so if this is something that's bringing up a lot of emotion for you, then I, again, invite you to just have the utmost grace with yourself and to explore these feelings further, possibly with a counselor if you need to, possibly through coaching. But what I'd invite you to do here is think about, are there any blockages that you have here in terms of your self-concept? Maybe you think that you are not worthy of having boundaries. You may not think that you deserve to have boundaries. So this is what I mean. These can be some really deep questions, and I would love for you to explore them, because if you don't think that you're a person who is worthy of boundaries, that you don't have the right to assert boundaries over your time, over what you're doing with your life, then you're going to struggle so much more when it comes to asserting those boundaries, and in particular, to dealing with situations where you have that pushback. So that is the first stage in the mindset. So this is the second step in the whole process, is looking at mindset. And it starts with this first question of, what do you make boundaries mean? And what do you believe about yourself in relation to boundaries? Now, when you're exploring boundaries, I would also love for you to do a deep dive into how you want to see boundaries. So there's that current way of thinking, that's your point A. But what if we were to move into much more intentionality around how you perceive boundaries and how you see yourself in relation to those boundaries? So what I would offer off the top is for you to imagine boundaries as something that is firm yet flexible. So the image that I love the most is backbone, right? I see a backbone as having structure, there's a firmness to it, and yet it is flexible. I find sometimes with boundaries, we tend to think that we need to be really rigid, that we need to set boundaries and it's black or white. And if you're not doing it perfectly, then don't bother doing it at all. And I don't think that's usually the most helpful approach to boundaries, right? I like to think of a spectrum, right? On one end of the spectrum, you have that extreme rigidity. You might think of a steel wall or a slab of marble. There's no give to it. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got this jellyfish, right? This sort of sloppy, amorphous pile of slimy ickiness, whatever it is, where there's no boundaries at all. And you don't want to be at either of those ends. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. And so for you, I would invite you to think about where that is. Now, this can be really helpful for yourself to define what your boundaries are, right? Where you're going to have that firmness, where you're going to introduce some flexibility, because you may have, for example, a general rule that you don't work on weekends, that is family time. You do not work on weekends. And yet, when you have a big project at work, or if you're going into trial, or you've got a closing and you are going to make an exception, you're going to do that on purpose, that you give yourself the flexibility to do that. It's helpful to have that framework for yourself. It's also helpful when you're dealing with others, right? When you have others who you're dealing with, and I'm thinking about the example of delegating and you have somebody where you're met with that resistance. When you yourself have firm but flexible boundaries, then it may be easier when you're speaking with somebody else to imagine that they too have a similar setup, that they have boundaries, and that there may be times that they're willing to move on those boundaries in exceptional times. And so the conversations that you're having with them may be more productive when you're learning more about what their boundaries are and where they have flexibility and where they do not. And I'm not suggesting that if somebody has a firm deadline where they need to pick their kid up from daycare, that you require that they be there late on those days. That may not be a place where they have flexibility. But if there are options that are workarounds that respect the boundary, but also incorporate that fluidity, that's where you might start to find some winning solutions. And so you adopting that lens, that framework may be helpful, not only for yourself, but also in your conversations with others. I would also invite you to think about your boundaries as a moving target. Your boundaries are going to evolve over time throughout your career. If I look at my own career, my boundaries when I was a junior lawyer were basically non-existent. Now, first of all, I wasn't even thinking about boundaries. Boundaries were never part of the conversation. I don't blame this on anybody. I think I grew up in a time where people didn't really talk about boundaries. And so I just didn't have them. And I also wasn't really thinking about my boundaries. What I was most interested in my early years of practice was gaining as much experience as I possibly could in the shortest amount of time. So when other lawyers asked me to work on weekends, I did not have a problem with that. When I was working late at the office, I had no problem with that. I wanted to do those things. Boundaries became more of an issue for me when I had children, and all of a sudden I had bookends on my day. I had times that I needed to be home to pick my kids up from daycare, to relieve the nanny, because if I didn't do that, my kids would be on their own, and that was not acceptable. And so I needed to learn how to implement boundaries when it became necessary for me. And as my career has evolved, I've also started to find that boundaries have become a lot more relevant in terms of where I focus my energy and my attention. So as my time has become more strict, as I've had to become more strict with my time because of the number of things that I want to do and the responsibilities that I have, I'm more particular about where I choose to spend my time. So I've become more mindful of my boundaries. And I would invite you to think about for yourself how your boundaries have shifted over the course of your career. So if you're really just first starting out, you may have a very different approach to your practice relative to a lawyer who's been in practice for several years, who has decided that they want to dial up their boundaries. And it may be that you're early in your career and you've already decided. I meet lots of lawyers who are earlier in their years of practice, and they've already established that they have a very particular idea of what they want their life to look like. And they're going to do that from the start. They're quite different in the sense from how I was when I started out. And that's a choice that they are making. So for you, I'd invite you to think about what that looks like for you. So boundaries, we're thinking about, what you're currently believing to be true about boundaries and about yourself. We're looking at boundaries as a firm but flexible barrier that protects the things that are important to you. We're looking at how your boundaries can shift over time. Your boundaries may also be different in different areas of your life. So you might find that you're really great at setting up boundaries in your personal life, but not so much at work, or vice versa. You might find that you're really good at protecting time set aside for your health, but maybe less good at setting time aside for your friends. You're going to need to do that assessment for yourself and decide, okay, here's how I've set up my boundaries. Is it something that you like? Do you like the way that you framed it? And then here's what's going to be most important as we move from this stage, in this mindset stage. So we're thinking about how we're thinking about boundaries. And what I would love for you to be able to identify is where you want your boundaries to be. So what is it that you are protecting? What do your boundaries look like? What degree of flexibility do you want to have? And this step is really important because we're going to next communicate your boundaries. And to communicate your boundaries, you first need to have clarity over what it is that you are trying to communicate. So step one we talked about was raising your awareness of boundaries, where you're struggling, any individuals that you're struggling with in particular. Step two was doing this deep work, this mindset work, where you're really unpacking how you think about boundaries, how you think about yourself, noting that your boundaries are going to shift over time. They're going to be stronger in some areas, weaker in other areas. And then let's get clear about what the boundaries are that you want to assert, what you want them to look like at this stage in your life, and even identify some of the conversations that you may need to have in order to set those boundaries and protect them. So the third stage is communication. And this is where you may need help if communicating your boundaries is an area where you have struggled. And what I've seen is sometimes because you feel uncomfortable about boundaries, you're not clear enough when it comes to communicating them. You might think that you're communicating a clear boundary, but in fact, you're using language that is not specific enough. You think that the other person understands what you're talking about, but they don't understand what you're talking about. And so the message doesn't get communicated in a way that they can then do the thing that you want them to do. What I've also noticed is that sometimes you may be so reluctant to set boundaries in the first place that you don't set them at all. And so you can end up taking on more than you're comfortable with. You can then become resentful. And sometimes that might even lead to lashing out. Or when you do finally go to assert a boundary, you are in that state of almost fight or flight, right? It's harder to regulate your emotions. So instead of having a calm, clear, well thought out conversation about boundaries, it's almost like this, I don't want to say explosive. I think that's too strong, but it's not a conversation where you come across as measured and in control and grounded in that conversation. So I think you can probably, here I am not being very clear in what I'm trying to say, but the point I'm trying to make here is when you are reactive in dealing with your boundaries, instead of being proactive, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute, your communication of your boundaries may come across as erratic. It may come across as not calm, right? It's kind of like you might just not explain it very well, not explain it very clearly. And so as a result, they aren't as effective when you try to set those boundaries. This might happen in a professional context. It might happen in your personal context, right? You might find that there are friends or family members and you say yes, 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 until the point where you just can't take it anymore. And then you just kind of lose the plot. And this is what we're trying to avoid. And the way to avoid that is by being intentional and having those conversations proactively. So I'm going to offer some suggestions. First, when it comes to boundaries, and then second, when it comes to asking for what you need, because there's similar conversations, but there's a few differences between the two. So in either case, what I'm inviting you to do is to be proactive. So we don't want to wait until the roof is leaking to go up there and start to fix it. What we want to do is have those conversations on a sunny day where everybody's happy. You may not have an immediate problem, but what you're doing is you're setting the groundwork for the inevitable, the days when all the work comes in at once, the days when people are going to lean on you to do things and you're going to have to say no. We want to set the framework up now. So number one is we're not going to wait for a crisis. And what we're going to do is we're going to identify the people that we need to speak with, and we're going to approach them proactively. We're going to approach them calmly, and we're going to be solutions focused. Now, what I would invite you to do here is think about the way in which the boundary can be a benefit to the other person, to the organization at large. Often when we think of boundaries, I think we go into it thinking about ourselves, how we will benefit from having that boundary. And it's great. We do want to benefit ourselves. And when it comes to communicating that boundary to somebody else, it helps if we can get their buy-in as well. And so you might be able to explain your boundary in a way that resonates with them, that lights them up, that they think, you know what, this is really a great solution for everybody involved. So for example, if the problem is that you're getting too much work and you don't have the time to do it all, you might talk about how bringing in other lawyers to do that work would be helpful in the long run. Maybe there are lawyers who aren't getting enough exposure and they need to get training. And one way for them to get training is to take on some of this work. You may be able to offer to help with some of that training. Maybe not, depends on your capacity to do that. But the person who you're talking to about that then sees how this is an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for you to move things off of your plate. It's an opportunity to train others. It's an opportunity to expand the capacity of the team to do more work. So that's an example of going into that conversation where it's calm, it's well thought out. You've identified a problem, you've identified a solution, you've offered something that is constructive and solutions focused to the person that you're talking about. That's quite different, for example, from approaching the conversation from the lens of, you know what, this is too much. I'm not doing it anymore. End of story. So that is the suggestion there. The other suggestion I would offer here is be prepared to set your boundary more than once. This was something that Bina Stock suggested when she came onto the podcast to talk about boundaries, and it stuck with me. I think this is such a great piece of advice, and so I'm repeating it here. When you go to set a boundary, in our dream world, I think we all hope that that person is going to say, you know what, Paula, you're absolutely right. That's a great idea. And look, you've even proposed a way for us to solve this going forward. Perfect. Let's move forward. But the reality is that if there is a system in place where you are finding that you need to set a boundary, you may not be able to solve that problem with a single conversation. And it doesn't mean that other people are not trying to help. It doesn't mean that they don't want to respect your boundary. It probably means that people are busy and the work is coming in and they don't know what else to do. So they're sending it your way. And so you may need to be proactive, continuing proactive, and you may need to have this conversation more than once. So let's be prepared for that. Now, the second situation that I'd love to talk about is when you are trying to set your expectations or seek out help from others, right? This is that situation where you've got other lawyers that maybe you want to delegate work to. You've got staff who you are trying to delegate work to, and they are saying no to you. So again, I'd invite you to be proactive. If you've noticed a pattern, if you've noticed that this is difficult, I would recommend are better off to take initiative and set up a meeting with that person, with those people, in order to have a conversation with them. Now, when you go into that conversation, I recommend approaching that conversation from a place of curiosity instead of from a place of judgment. Let's not come up with theories as to why so-and-so doesn't want to do your work or why they're taking on their work and doing it inadequately. Let's not have any of those theories. Let's approach the conversation from a place of curiosity. Now, in the next step, this is where you need to be really clear with whoever it is that you're speaking with about what it is that you need. So what does that look like? It may mean that you need to be really specific about working on a weekend. If you're a transactional lawyer and there are going to be times when you need help on a weekend, it helps to be able to say to the person that you're speaking with, listen, here's how the practice is going to work. If I can avoid having you work on a weekend, I will avoid it. But the reality is that sometimes clients come to me on a Friday afternoon and they need something by a Monday morning, and I'm going to need your help in getting that done. And so this is what the expectation is going to be. This is what it's going to look like. Do you have any questions? So you're explaining to them that sometimes they will need to work on weekends. They may genuinely not know that. Same holds true if it's work on the evenings. Or maybe you're not a transactional lawyer, you're a trial lawyer or some other type of lawyer. So you'd want to explain the situation that could arise where you would need their help outside of regular hours. Now, it may be that you need timeliness in terms of the work that you're giving to them, the response that you're expecting. And so you may need to be really specific. When I send you an email, I need a response within 3 hours of sending that email. If I send you an email and it says this is not urgent, then a different rule applies. Or maybe it's vice versa. Maybe the normal timing for an email response is if you can get back to me by the end of the day or the following morning, that's usually good enough. But if I say that it's urgent, it means I really need to have a response within an hour. So be really specific in terms of the communications that you have, because that way there's no guessing, there's no gap in communication, and then that person has an opportunity to ask you questions, to seek clarification. Now, it may be the level of detail that is required in terms of the work. So I've heard this from lawyers who try to delegate to staff, who try to delegate to other lawyers, and the quality of work that comes back isn't detailed enough. So if that is an issue, then explain to them what type of detail you need from them. It may also be how far you want somebody to go on their own before they circle back to speak with you. This is an area where a lot of lawyers struggle at all levels, frankly, because they get sent out to do a task. Maybe they've never done it before. Maybe it's a research task and they've entered this black hole of no information. And so how long do they go before they come back to you with an answer? So let people know, right? What is the expectation? What do you expect them to do before they come back to you to ask further questions? You might also explain why it matters. Why is it important for them to do these things? And then finally, I would also be prepared, much like you were preparing yourself in the boundaries conversation, prepare yourself for pushback, right? Prepare yourself for situations where they're going to say that they can't do it or they won't do it, and how you want to deal with that. Now, in either of these conversations, when you're going to set boundaries or you're asking for what you need, the first approach, right? The first step is having that conversation directly with the person who you are working with. That is the first conversation that I would encourage you to have. But in either of those cases, if you have the conversation and nothing changes, either you're trying to set a boundary and your requests are falling on deaf ears, or you're trying to delegate to somebody on your team and they're simply refusing to help you, that's when you need to bring in some help. That means bringing in the help of management. Maybe it's another lawyer. Maybe it's the human resources department. Maybe it's one of your colleagues. Maybe it's your department head, and talk to them. You don't need to do this on your own. Get the support that you need internally to help you manage the relationship, to manage and help you get what it is that you need in this particular situation. Now, if you are on your own and you are all of those things, you're the department head, you're the leader, then you might look outside of yourself to get the support you need, whether that's working with a coach, whether that's working with a mentor, but find somebody that you can have those conversations with, because you might need that support. You might need that sounding board in order to understand how best to proceed. Now, when it comes to delegating, a little subnote here, it's a little bit of a nuance, but what I've noticed is that sometimes people try really hard to encourage others to deliver a quality of work that maybe is beyond their capacity, or maybe they're asking them to do a job that they simply don't want to do. And so we want to be mindful and notice, like, is this a boundaries issue or is this a willingness to work issue? And sometimes it's going to be a willingness to work issue or a capacity issue. That person simply isn't the right person, the right fit for the job. Now, the other thing I would suggest here is to get support for yourself. So maybe that support is internal. If you are on your own, maybe you've already reached out for a coach. But if you're anticipating difficult conversations, you might need someone in your corner to help back you up. Again, that could be a mentor, it could be a coach, it could be a counselor, it could be a friend, it could be a group, but make sure that you feel supported in these conversations. And I mentioned earlier that I'm offering my group coaching and mastermind program again, starting in July. And that has been an environment in which I've witnessed so much support for the women in the group. We just finished boundaries actually this month. We had some really powerful conversations about boundaries, because even though everybody's practice looks different, the topic of boundaries is one that we can all relate to, right? The challenges that come with setting the boundaries in the first place, dealing with pushback. And so this might be an opportunity for you, if there's an area where you're struggling, to find that support that you're looking for, whether it's joining the group that I'm forming or joining some other group where you can have that support. So in terms of what we just talked about then, I'd like to recap, and to have a little bit of fun with that, I'm also going to do it in a bit of a do and don't format. So first of all, we talked about that awareness piece. So the do is to prioritize boundaries. The don't is to wait for permission. If you wait for others to give you permission to get clear about your boundaries, you may find yourself waiting for a very long time. The second area was mindset, doing that deep work in terms of reevaluating the way that you think about boundaries. And so the do here is to question your beliefs about boundaries, about yourself, and to clarify what you need. The don't here is to simply accept at face value the beliefs about boundaries that others offer up to you. They may not be helpful. They may not align with what it is that you truly want. So the third, the do, was to communicate clearly and proactively about your boundaries, right? We want to be clear. We want to be firm. We don't want to leave things to chance. The don't there is do not make assumptions about what the other person is thinking, how they're going to react when you go to set your boundary or to request help from them. And finally, that fourth area, and I apologize for overlooking that, is that if you go through those first three steps, then you will either find people are responsive or not. And so you may find yourself in a question of whether or not the environment that you're in is the right environment for you. I have spoken with lawyers who report to me that they work in environments that simply do not support having boundaries. You may find yourself in an environment that is like that, where maybe leadership is saying that boundaries are good, that people should set boundaries, that they don't want you working over a certain number of hours. And yet in practice, what you see is that the people who are rewarded are the people who have the fewest boundaries, where they are working the hours that you may not be capable, available, or willing to work. You might find that your organization overall does adhere to a certain code where boundaries are respected, but within the group that you work, maybe the culture is such that boundaries are not respected. And so what I'd invite you to think about is whether you want to stay where you are, right? If you're in an environment where you feel like your boundaries are not being respected, if you're in an environment where you don't have access to the support that you need, it may be that you need to make a shift. So again, I'd encourage you to go through those first 3 steps, see what you can do within the organization if you want to, right? You might listen to this podcast episode and decide for yourself that, you know what, there's no point. I don't want to do this work here. I'd much rather try to find another environment where I feel like I'm being heard. And so that is a decision that you'll want to make. And the do and don't that I would offer in relation to your environment is the do is evaluate where you are, evaluate your current situation and decide whether it's somewhere that you want to be. And the don't there is don't suffer in silence. Don't suffer alone. Get help if this is a situation where you are struggling and you would like additional support. And that could be help within your organization. It could be help outside of your organization. But the idea there is not to suffer alone. So what I've described in this episode has really been some deep work. It is work that can be really uncomfortable. It can involve an entire shift in your identity in terms of how you relate to boundaries, in terms of how you think about yourself. It may mean that you start to set boundaries and ask for help. And this may be different for some of the people that are used to you being a certain way. And again, I'd go back to that transformation concept, right? If what you're doing right now isn't working, that you feel like you're not being heard, and you're trying to shift into that second paradigm where you have boundaries, where you feel confident asserting your boundaries, there are going to be shifts that you will need to make. These may be shifts that you identified during today's podcast, areas where you can take action. And so that may feel really uncomfortable, especially as you're going through that process. And what I would invite you to think about is what that's going to look like on the other side for you. Now, there are a number of skills that will be required to make this happen. The first of which is gaining clarity about where your limits are currently and what it is that you need. It means being willing to have difficult conversations and asking for what you need. It means accepting that you may disappoint others. It may mean accepting that you may no longer be everybody's go-to or everybody's hero. And it might mean dealing with the discomfort that can happen when a vacuum is created, right? If you start setting boundaries, if you start delegating your work, you might find that you now have more time on your hands and you're going to feel a little bit uneasy. What do you do to fill that time? And so figuring out what that looks like for you. And when you're not in that reaction mode where you're dealing with all those inputs and you don't have enough support, you might find that when you do start to free up your capacity, that you start to see other opportunities, areas that you want to go into more intentionally as opposed to being in that more reactive state. What this will create for you is that you may find that you step into a greater sense of leadership when you have your boundaries and you're able to assert them and you're able to deal even with those objections that you have when you try to assert those boundaries. You may then start to feel more confident. You feel like you have more agency. You are now modeling for others what it looks like to set boundaries and to delegate and to build your team in a way that is proactive, in a way that is calm, in a way that is confident. You'll feel more in control. You'll feel more confident. You will see yourself as a leader as opposed to somebody who simply accepts what is handed to her. You will have greater clarity over where you need to set those boundaries because you now have a much clearer sense of what is important to you and how you want those boundaries to look, what degree of flexibility you choose to have. You may then feel like your practice is more sustainable, that you're able to do it over the long haul. And what you might find is that you actually shift your success strategy. So if your strategy to date has been to be the person who deals with anything, anytime, who can always be relied on in a pinch, who is everybody's right-hand person, everybody's go-to, if that has been your identity, what you might find is that your identity starts to shift. And instead of that being your success strategy, you might find that you adopt a new success strategy, right? You might become the person that people come to when they're looking for input on strategy, when they're looking for someone to help them build a team, when they're looking for advice about how to delegate to others. So that will be really interesting for you to see, talking back about that vacuum, right? What are you going to build in place of this skill that you had of being everything to everybody and working hard and getting things done? You will still be working hard. I'm sure you'll still be getting things done, but in a different way. And what is that going to look like for you? You will also find that you may start to influence culture. So again, going back to that question of environment, you may be in an environment right now where currently the status quo or the norm is not to be respectful of boundaries, is not to enforce them the way that you would like, but your influence may actually create a culture shift. So that's another result that you might create. And then finally, you may feel a greater degree of confidence. And you may find, again, going back to that question of mindset and that deep work around boundaries, that you have a new relationship with boundaries, a new relationship with yourself when it comes to boundaries, a more robust self-concept, which operates at an unconscious level to permeate in all facets of your life. So, my dear friend, thank you again for joining me for this podcast episode. It has been such a pleasure to connect with you and talk about this topic. I would invite you to think about what we've explored today, how it applies to you, and identify one or two takeaways that you can apply right away in your practice and in your personal life. Now, once again, I will be having a free webinar on June 14th at noon Pacific time. I would love to have you there. So please do join me. If you know anybody that you think would enjoy it, please feel free to invite them as well. Maybe you can do some of the work together. That would be a lot of fun. And if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to reconnecting next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.